Actually, remind me, I'm just wearing a sweatshirt. Is this the video podcast or
No, no,
should
no. I do video it. I don't use the video at all. If I were to use anything, it would be me, but
Okay.
it wouldn't be my guest. So you don't, yeah, no need for the suit, getting out the suit.
And like right when I was like logging in, I'm like, well, I'm wearing an Arctic Monkey sweatshirt. And I'm like, well,
See,
I wouldn't mind telegraphing that to everybody. Like, I wouldn't
you
mind
know,
telling everybody that,
that's
but
part of the things that go in the show is like I'm wearing an Arctic Monkey sweatshirt, which is
yeah.
great. Yeah. This is What Next, the Adoptee Rights Podcast. I'm Gregory Luce, the Executive Director of Adoptees United and an adoptee rights lawyer. I'm also an adopted person, born and adopted in the District of Columbia. In each episode of What Next, I talk about what's on our minds, whether it's the state of adopted people and adoptee rights around the world, legislative issues, interviews, or the frequent absurdities and complications of being an adopted person. The next two back-to-back episodes are part of what we're calling Legislative Bootcamp, where I'm talking to legislators, staffers, advocates, and as many people who will talk to me about how to pursue or oppose legislation, whether related to birth records, U.S. citizenship, rescinding an adoption, or advocating for the dignity and autonomy of all adopted people. In the first two, released together, I talked with Max Aulbach and Ayanna Smith-Koyman, two legislative staffers in Michigan and Minnesota, where there are bills that have been recently enacted or are currently pending. But it's less about the bills. It's more about the process, especially in how to work well with legislative staff or the people I consider the backbone of legislative work.
My name is Max Aulbach. I serve as the legislative director for State Representative Christian Grant. So we are the 82nd district in Michigan, or the state house. So we cover basically the southeast side of Grand Rapids, which is like a dense kind of urban core sort of district. And yeah, personally, I've been at the house for 3.5 years now so far. I think we're coming up on there. So I've been around for a second.
Yeah, and I mean, to my appearances, you look pretty young. I'm assuming, did you come straight out of college and start working in legislative work?
Well, it's interesting because I did have like a year off. So I graduated 2019. So I didn't start working in the legislature until like the end of 2020. I kind of came from like the restaurant industry before college and during college, and even a little bit after college, I was serving tables because I wasn't 100% sure what I was going to do, and
Right.
just sort of like not trying to rush into anything, and frankly save more money. I had exactly $2 in my bank account when I was done paying for college. So I was like,
Right.
all right, let's just rebuild some money for a second. But very quickly after the beginning of the pandemic, I joined the Biden campaign as a field organizer that we worked remotely. And that got me some connections that allowed me to apply for then State Representative David LeGrand. And I, was a local guy, and he's a local guy, and had a big focus on like hiring in-district people. And I happened to check a few of the boxes that they were looking for. So I got pretty lucky, I think. And then it just sort of clicked, and I was able to kind of like, start out as a, front desk staffer, eventually moved to be his legislative director. And then when time came for him to finish his term, I became a pretty qualified candidate for the next successor. Now the districts got redrawn, so it's not a genuine successor, but the next person that came, which is my current boss, Christian Grant. So things have worked out pretty good. I'm pretty
Yeah.
happy with
So,
it.
do you stay within the district, or is it really up to the incoming rep, or if this is a Senate, the senator?
That's a great question. So, I mean, it's all up to the discretion of like your boss. I would say most people are probably Lansing based. That's just, we don't get paid for the commute. But at least in our office, we really, really emphasize like being in the district and always being in the community.
Right.
And personally, I grew up in Grand Rapids. Like the district we represent is where I grew up, which is always really, really important to me. I don't really
Yeah.
have a whole lot of interest in working for people that don't represent like my neighborhoods. It's just sort of like my personal stake in it that I care about. Doesn't mean I won't in the future at some point, but at least like right now it's a big priority. So we all commute to Lansing, which is like about an hour drive. It's really not too terrible, and I've been doing it now for like 3 years, so
Hmm.
you kind of get used to it. There's merits on both sides. Some people live in Lansing. I think that's kind of the expectation. Obviously, that is like your full-time job, but with these jobs, it's weird because your interests are split. Like you have all the legislative stuff happening in Lansing, but then you have all the constituent stuff still happening in, your district.
Right.
And like at the very least, I think usually like one person will have some district ties. In this case, our entire office is living in Grand Rapids. But it's totally the discretion of the boss. The only thing is that we just don't get reimbursed for gas no
Right.
matter what,
You don't get
which
a
is
per
like,
diem. Like I think a lot of legislators get a per diem for the time.
yeah, no, the legislators will, because like they obviously have to live in their district because they're representing the district. Like their residency has to be established there. So I think that's why they do that. But then staffers, we're just a bunch of floating people, like who
And
knows where we are.
so, and you're in the House, and
Yeah.
I imagine it varies a little bit in the Senate, but how many staff members does a representative typically have?
So yeah, I mean, I think when people think about like legislative offices, they automatically think of Congress, where it's like a representative with like different departments and staff and people that head up various different issues. State house offices are small. So I have one other staffer, who's, and I guess we can get into the terms, but like I'm legislative director, and the front person is usually the legislative aide. And then typically we have like a paid intern. So it's like a staff of like what I'll say two and a half, just because the intern can only work half the hours. And we can take on more unpaid interns, but obviously they're interns, so they're more there to learn and be like a core function of the office. But yeah, it's pretty small. So, we handle smaller districts. It makes sense. It's a resource thing. And it's just sort of the system that's been in place for a long time. Certain offices will maybe get an additional staffer, depending if like they're higher up in leadership. So, they just have more to do. They get more money to run the offices. And it also varies that like the majority will have more money for staff because they run committees. So right now we technically have a higher allotment, but it's not enough to like hire an entire new staffer. It's basically like if a rep can move money around to try to, find another part-time person. But
Right.
for the most part, our teams are very, very small.
Right.
So, our workloads are typically pretty high.
Yeah, and I'm hoping to talk to the South Dakota rep who was involved in a bill that we were involved in and who has no staff. So there's, it varies across the country. Some
Yeah.
legislators have zero staff and it's just them, and some have
By choice, or
like
like they really just don't get staff.
right. Some like California, I swear every office has 10 staffers with all the different titles. And so it will vary by state, but what's if someone says I'm a legal director or legislative director for a House representative in Michigan, what does that essentially mean?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think well, one funny thing about this job is that like it all makes sense to me, but it's not a common title, and not a lot of people know what it means. I used to joke that like it sounds like a made up job. Like if I was trying to convince somebody like I'm a legislative director and like, oh, I don't know enough about that to dispute it, so we're just
Right.
gonna go ahead and just believe you.
It is a term of
Uh,
art though for across the country. I mean,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, no, and the way I best described it is that it's like Schoolhouse Rock. It's like how a bill becomes a law. How I've typically like described my job is not necessarily being like the expert on any specific policy issue, but being the expert on the process. Kind of being like a shepherd of sorts, where it's like, okay, we have a bill or an idea. How do we get this into law? Like,
right,
what are the steps that we have to take? And like,
right,
my boss obviously has competing interests all the time. She has to do a million different things. So my focus is that she'll come to me with an idea. She's like, hey, yeah, there's something with nursing homes and like people having to sell their houses and people losing their houses, even though they try to put it in their kid's name, and then the state comes after the house. It's an issue that I've never heard of before. And then suddenly it's presented to me as like, okay, we need to do something about that. Which starts with me researching it, finding out if that really is an issue, which actually has come up. Maybe it's hearsay and we find out it's actually not an issue. But if it is, I find out, okay, well, what is there we can do about it? And sometimes it's finding out if it's a local, state, or federal issue. Obviously that then, changes like our approach. But if it's state, then there's probably something in the law, like in the Michigan compiled law, that we can change to fix that or add more protections or prohibit somebody from doing something. And then what's also kind of funny about my job, you can be a lawyer for this job, but many, many are not.
right,
So I work with attorneys to draft legislation where I basically ask them, hey, here's a bunch of research, here's what we want to do. Can you put it into legalese for me? And I take that draft, go to like, let's say for that nursing home example, I go to the nursing homes and I go, hey, I have this bill that might impact you guys. What do you think about it? And then maybe we find out that this destroys the nursing home funding
right.
mechanism. Or I go to obviously the state of Michigan or the treasury, because like that's why they were trying to get that house, is because they're trying to recoup funds that were used to place that person in the nursing home. It's all really complicated issues. So it requires a full-time person to not necessarily, be that policy expert, but know the right people to talk to and the smart people to talk to that understand the issue and try to get to a good place that you can find a bill that like somewhat fixes the problem.
Right.
And like it's always dense and like it is, no problem is easy to solve. It's definitely like I've had the easiest bills on the planet that when I say quote unquote easiest, that ended up being like the biggest headaches because there was some stakeholder out there that was like, actually, this ruins my life. So
Right.
I'm gonna fight you pretty
Exactly.
hard on it. But yeah, I think that's kind of like a pretty good like rudimentary idea. Is like it's just about taking an idea
Hmm.
and just slowly churning it into a law. And it's an arduous process, so it definitely takes a lot of time.
And you're walking it through that process.
Yeah, I always like to describe I'm like a facilitator or like a shepherd, which
Yeah,
kind
I
of
mean,
sounds
as an example, I know that Representative Grant, we have a bill that she's sponsoring that is very important to the adoptee rights community.
yeah.
And it sounds as if she may have come to you saying, "Hey, this is something I want to pursue," but you're also getting contact from people in the community who are impacted by the bill. And so, where do these ideas originate? Is it typically from the representative you're in the office with, or from the community, or both?
Yeah, that's another great question. I mean, it comes from everywhere. I think the best ideas come from the representative having a personal stake in it. And in our case, Representative Grant's mother was adopted, so there was like an actual exposure to the issue that we're trying to solve with that legislation, rather than alternatively where sometimes like a lobby firm or an advocacy group will approach a representative about their issue, and that the representative doesn't have a tie to, but they're just trying to convince them to take on the idea. Now, that's also a valid way of going about it. But I think the best ideas are the ones that have like the passion behind them, and like the personal connection. And as I'm sure you know, Greg, like, Erica had connections with Representative Grant. There were some relationships that had existed far prior to the pursuit of the legislation. And like because those relationships are already built, it makes that process like a little bit easier because there are so many things that we're doing at the same time that it kind of takes that personal stake to elevate one issue above another.
Right.
And that kind of like, motivates it. But ideas come from everywhere. I mean, we've had ideas come from just a constituent saying, this is the problem that I'm having. And then we find out that it's actually a much bigger problem than we expected. Something that we can't necessarily write an email to the department about to have them fix, but finding out that they're restricted by the law. Ideas really can come from anywhere. It's kind of wild.
Yeah, and I'm assuming though it would for something to come from someone in the community, it needs to be, at least for your purposes, someone who's a constituent.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it can come from anywhere, but for the most part, yeah, it should come from somebody that's a constituent. I mean, there is like a decorum like between offices that like if we have somebody outside our district reach out to us, we refer them to their district, because like we don't want to meddle between the relationship between a constituent and their elected official.
Right.
But representatives collaborate all the time. On the adoption legislation that we're working on, obviously, we're working with Representative Pat Outman, who also had a constituent have exposure to the same issue. Now those two instances happened alone. Like we didn't coordinate that at all. We just came back to Lansing and found out he was also kind of working on the same issue, and then we realized, okay, you're working on it. We want to work on it. How about we work together? So in that case, you can get other constituents involved, but certainly like the priority comes from like the people in our district.
Right. Yep. And that's where it was, as you say, it was both. It was Representative Grant,
Yeah,
who's this issue is a passionate one for her, and Erica Curry, who is a constituent and wanted to see a change in Michigan. So it all sort of came together that way. And I think
yeah,
one thing you mentioned, which I think is super important, is that this relationship that Erica had with Representative Grant went pretty far back.
yeah,
And that's really that upfront work that you do as an advocate. You just don't, for the most part, sometimes you do, but for the most part, you just don't show up at an office saying, "Hey, I want you to write this bill." And
yes.
it instantly becomes something that the rep may pursue. It's just, there's so many different factors that go into that.
Oh, I
And
mean, without a
relationship
doubt.
is a big one. Yeah.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. I mean, something that I say to like just so many folks when they're kind of learning about like the legislature is just like we are pulled in 1,000 different directions every given moment. Like there are a million causes that are all valid and need addressing. But there are 110 reps, so people sort of pick their battles. We'll support other people's work, we'll vote in support of it, but you always need a fighter, you need a champion for any given issue that it was actually gonna, make this thing into law. So like we have to be picky about the things that we do. I'm not going to go through every single bill that we're working on, but I know for a fact not all of them are going to go.
Right.
It's like you got to prioritize and pick the ones that are going to work. So when someone comes to the office with like, I have this idea to do this, oftentimes it's like, great. um, Good luck,
Right.
unless it does register really strongly with us, or we have that personal connection. And like, there's a much broader conversation around, like the political climate and like what's possible, what's not, timelines. But, just like one email about a bill is not going to make us do the bill.
Right.
Even many emails might not, it's going to be kind of elevating it to a personal connection, and really can once again, in whatever avenue, convincing my boss that it's something that she wants to do.
Right. And I think I mean, the bills, the 5148 and 5149, which are now in the Senate as
Yeah.
we record this, this issue went back years, even with a bill that was kind of looked at in 2019. It wasn't a good bill. And then suddenly the Senate, the House, and the governorship is all controlled by Democrats, which is an opportunity because we felt that this is a way that we were able to do this in Minnesota, but also when you have a trifecta, not always, but sometimes easier to
Yeah.
get priority legislation across the line. But what's nice about this one is that, as you say, Representative Altman, he's a Republican and he's invested in this issue too. So we have a bipartisan issue that is has leadership on both from people from both parties, and I think that's going to make a difference in the end. I
Yeah.
hope.
No,
Yeah,
no,
you never know.
no, I mean, I think so. I've always kind of emphasized, like being in the legislature just a little bit longer. Like I worked in a legislature where we were in the minority, and it was like a big adjustment to like learn what it's like to be in control, particularly in
Right,
Michigan, where like we had not been in control for a very long time. But I remember thinking like there's some stuff that's always going to be partisan that we need to take advantage of the trifecta and like really move some stuff. And I'm not going to go ahead and go through all the great things that like the House Democrats and the Senate Democrats have done. But I think it's very, very important to still pursue bipartisan stuff, and to extend that olive branch. I'm really big on that. So when it came to like this legislation, like, there are some partisan angles on it that I know Greg is aware of, but it was such a great opportunity to do something bipartisan. I think it's a good example of like legislation that has not yet been like politically hot, and
right,
is able to get through almost non-controversially. There's obviously we've gone through many drafts and had, taken in feedback and gotten opposition, but not to the same level of something that's like causing like rifts within the legislature.
right,
So I think it's always good, like every session, to have good legislation that's bipartisan, just to show, like, guys, I know we kind of get caught up in the fighting, but there is good policy that's happening, and it's bipartisan. And like it might still be debatable, but it's not going to fall directly on that partisan line
right.
automatically
Yep.
like other stuff does.
Yeah, and I sometimes fear that our issue becomes a hot issue because I think that makes it so much more complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much. Everyone digs in, and it's just really tough to get it across the line. So
Yeah.
you did something that I've never seen before, which I don't know if you've ever
Okay.
you'll realize what I'm talking about, where Representative Grant was ill on the day that the bill was presented in committee in the House. And you ended up presenting the bill as on
Yeah.
behalf of her office. Have you ever done that before?
Weirdly, yes. Not the exact same circumstance. I'm gonna call this similar legislation because it was also bipartisan, but it's a kind of a different realm. But like I did, with my old boss, did like a reform of like the CPS Central Registry.
Right,
Um, we could do another podcast about that entire subject. But like I had that happen where my boss was supposed to be there for a hearing and we didn't know. Like it was just like it just wires got crossed or something. I happened to be there because I wanted to be. And then the chair was like, "Oh yeah, we want LeGrand to speak." And I'm like, "He's not here." He's like, "Well, do you want to speak?" And at that time, this was like 2 years ago. And then I ended up doing it, which was like a lot of fun. And yeah, this very similar thing happened with this legislation. You know, um, like a little bit of context, like, last year we adjourned like November 8th, I believe,
right,
which put a really big time crunch on the legislation. Now, we had enough consensus in the House that we were able to move it, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen automatically. So there was a lot of like goodwill that was put into getting a hearing and a vote and a session vote all in the same week, so the stakes were pretty high. And then Representative Grant got sick. The caucus was moving so quickly that last fall because there was like that timeline that was like stressing everybody out that reps are dropping like flies. The
Right.
workload was extreme. So yeah, she was ill that same day. So I hopped in and I testified alongside Representative Outman. Kind of interesting. I hope this is like a badge of honor, but the two times that I've testified, it's been with us. I'm a Democratic staffer, and I did it alongside a Republican state representative.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, the two times that I've done it. But yeah, I mean, that's my job too, is to be ready to do that.
Right.
And that was the first time I did it for Representative Grant. I remember telling her, like, I can do it. This is what I'm here for. Like I don't want to do it every single time for you because you are the representative, but in extreme circumstances, like I'm ready for this.
Right.
And and then I did it. It was a lot of fun, and bills got voted out. So
Yeah. It was
it was
great.
it was a really cool moment.
Yeah, it was super cool. Yeah, and I don't know if you can do that in other states, actually. I asked one staffer and she said, absolutely not. There's no way we could have done that. Yeah, so
Oh wow, no,
super cool.
staffers in Michigan testify all the time.
Oh, interesting.
Well, maybe not all the time, but it is a regular occurrence because just from a committee schedule standpoint, like representatives can't always be there.
Right,
The intent is I would say 95% of the time it's the rep, but a
right.
solid 5% of the time, like they'll send their staffer, but mostly on non-controversial stuff. The stuff that we were doing was pretty dense, so I was like, oh, you want me to do it? Yeah, okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, we have a House bill now, or two House bills too, that are now in the Senate. And there's no, in many states, you have a companion bill that may be in the other house or other chamber.
Yeah.
How does it, what's your role as the representative legislative director once it's in the other chamber?
It's the same, we're two separate chambers, but that doesn't mean we don't talk to each other. There's no like laissez-faire, like, oh, once it's over there, hands off. Like I'm just gonna like let it roll like that. You need to remain active. So it's still talking to committee members, talking to the committee chair, requesting the hearing, doing relatively the same hearing and presentation, but just in the Senate, but obviously tailoring it now that you're in a different chamber. And the Senate also is different. It is a smaller chamber. There are fewer members. That usually means people frankly pay a little bit of a closer eye.
Right,
It's just a different body. You can go down to like the Federalist Papers about why the House and the Senate are different federally, and that tracks with the state legislature as well. So, it's really just doing the same thing. We're already having, working with Senator Shang, who chairs the committee that these bills are referred to try to get a hearing.
right,
But it is relatively the same process. Now, we didn't have to make any huge changes to the bills when they were in the House. We just had to make like some technical changes. Nobody really brought up any true like concerns that we needed to address in that moment. So we
right.
might have to do that in the Senate. My hope is not to. But that is something that we'll probably have to prepare for. That might make it a little bit different
Because they don't have
than
to
the
come
House.
back to the House for approval or concurrence with the House.
That's
Yeah,
exactly right.
yeah,
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 which I try to avoid just because I think with this it would be fine because it passes along such bipartisan lines
right.
last time. But like sometimes
It,
legislation can fall apart at any second. I've seen it. It's wild. It's really weird when you see a bill like get so far and so close, and then there's just one vote that just doesn't happen.
right.
So adding any extra hurdle or step usually gives me some anxiety.
Yep, some
Um,
timing issues. Yep,
yeah, and timing issues as
yep,
well. So my hope is to avoid that. But in this specific case, I think it would be fine.
yeah,
It's not like it has to go through the entire House committee and floor process again. It's mostly the House just like giving two thumbs up, being,
right.
what'd you do? Fine.
Yeah, no
You
big
know?
deal. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. One of the things you mentioned was being a field organizer for the Biden campaign. So you obviously have experience in organizing on a
Mm.
political level. And I'm wondering, I'll ask you generally, then I may give you some sort of lightning round questions. What do you feel is effective advocacy for a bill when it's really tough to get a rep's or a senator's attention?
Yeah.
There's all sorts of ways to communicate today. It's social media, it's email, it's online contact forms that the offices use, and wondering if could point out what may be the best way to advocate for a particular bill.
Yeah, I know it's a great question because like yeah, I'm of the mind that just sending an email doesn't work. I
Doesn't
think
work or does?
doesn't work.
Yeah,
Sending just like one email.
right,
Like if I sent emailed a Congresswoman Skolton saying I want you to do this bill, I'll get a polite response and it won't happen.
right,
And that's fine. I think you need to do coalition building, and that means reaching out to people that are not the state rep, but maybe your organization that might have a stake in that issue. Like that's kind of how some interests kind of get consolidated and some don't. There's a reason that the Michigan Bankers Association exists, is because
right,
like that's where bankers' interests are kind of funneled. And then there's a person that I talk to that's like the banker guy, or like
right,
the social services person or the nurses person, and often they, from like an organizational perspective, just have a little bit more strength. And then also regular advocacy organizations too. Like we have Safe and Just Michigan, so that's like a criminal justice organization, or we have the ACLU of Michigan. I think sometimes like working within those entities to advocate for something is more effective because they just have a direct line to us. I have contacts that are at those organizations that are able to, kind of let me know right away.
right.
Those are once again kind of like what we talked about earlier. Like existing relationships really help and kind of capitalizing on them. But building a relationship with your state rep at the local level, like I cannot, I don't want to like underemphasize grassroots activism, like going to coffee hours,
Right.
talking to your neighbors, showing up to coffee hours and relaying your issue with your state representative. Because like if you do that, very least like you are going to get a response, and I think there's a lot of power in numbers, and then showcasing it. And I think just kind of like building out your advocacy like around the representative. So you almost have to like you almost surround them with it,
Right.
like if I'm hearing an issue from multiple different people, I'm gonna have there's a lot more validity to it. It's like if you see multiple news sources reporting the same thing. If you see one person report, it's like, I don't know, you might be biased, it might be a little bit different. But if I see like the New York Times, Washington Post, and everybody say the same thing, I'm like, oh crap, that's news. So like just that coalition building, I think is really critical.
Yeah, I think, and that's what we have in Michigan. We have a coalition of uh, national group, which is Adoptee Rights Law Center, as well as two state groups, Adoptee Advocates of Michigan and Adoptee Michigan Adoptee Collaborative. So that's been really useful for us to
Yeah,
one be
exactly.
accountable to each other, but also I feel like because you are, as you know, and as I've talked to many staffers, you've got a gazillion things that you're doing every day, and there's, hundreds, if not thousands, of bills that are in the hopper, some of which are ones that you're closely following, some of which you're just,
Yeah.
maybe asked to support or oppose. But I've always felt that a coalition streamlines the communication with the reps, because it's not like 50 people contacting you
Yeah.
for a support of a bill. It's a organization or coalition that you trust, as you said, that is just, hey, what's up? Can you let us know what's happening and if there's anything we can do?
Yeah, I mean that's basically it.
Yeah,
Just that's basically it.
yeah,
And persistence too, I think is important. Like these projects don't like our terms are 2 years. That doesn't mean every project like starts and ends in 2 years. Like these are
right,
multi-year efforts.
right. That's a
Like I
great
mentioned
point.
earlier,
Yeah,
yeah, like there's a like when you get a bill like a certain amount of in the process, like yeah, the next session you do technically have to start back at introduction. But there's a lot of capital built in that bill. Like there's more stakeholder input in it. There's more advocacy grown around it, and it makes it easier to do next year. Like there are bills that we're working on right now that in my head are next year things.
right.
Like okay, this is good. We're gonna work on it, but do I think it's gonna get across the finish line? No, I really, I really, really don't. And it being an election year has a big, it's a big reason for that. But that doesn't mean we don't put the work in because we can start up next year now as a sophomore member with a lot more experience and a lot more capital, and then move it even quicker. You
Yeah, I
know,
think that's such an important point because I think a lot of people who are new to the process of advocacy feel like they've got one shot and that's it. When in fact
yeah,
what you've done, even if let's say 5148, 5149 doesn't make it through, we still have done a ton of education on the issue.
yeah,
Reps and senators would be aware of this issue. It just for whatever reason it didn't make it through, and you just come back. I mean, the bill that passed in Minnesota, which goes into effect in a few months, was a 25-year effort, if not
mhm,
more. And
No,
we,
it's
yeah, so it's a long game. It's never a short game, it seems.
no, it's never. I mean, for it to be a short game, you have to get like many important people to all think the same thing is important at the same time. That is extraordinarily difficult. Like
Right.
you can technically fast pass something, but you need like everybody to agree.
Yep.
And that's
Yeah.
not even like, and I'm not even meaning that like we need a bunch of Democrats in control, because guess what? Even Democrats disagree on what thing we should do first.
Right.
Like there's so many things to do, and that would be the case for the other side as well.
Right.
Like there's just only so much time and effort that we have and resources that like unfortunately, even with complete control, we just can't do everything. And also not all issues are partisan either. It's complicated.
Hmm.
My old boss has a phrase that I always like use, which is like complicated problems require complex solutions. It's like it none of this is easy. So it's really, really important to just kind of keep that in mind.
Yeah, and I think the bill that we have before the Senate now is a complex. It's not such a complex issue, but it's a complex bill in some
Yeah.
sense. Yeah.
No, I
Yeah.
would totally
Yeah.
agree with that. I
Yeah.
remember the first time you sent it to me, I was like, oh, okay.
Right. I
Well,
know.
I'm sure you know what's happening here.
Yeah.
And I have a
I
much
don't
firmer
I don't
yeah.
envy someone trying to figure out Michigan law on this issue because it's and hopefully, I mean, that's the idea though, is to simplify it to get you know a solution that at its core is right and just.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that a single email doesn't work. I've always wondered what you do. Let's say Representative Grant's on a committee hearing a bill, and let's say it's not our bill, it's let's say it's just any bill, and you get 100 emails from people all over the
Yeah.
place, not maybe not even constituents. How effective are those kind of mass campaigns? And what do you do with those 100, emails that you get in one day?
It's a you have a lot of great questions today, right? And you're touching on everything that a staffer touches on. So if every single one of those emails says the same thing,
Uh-huh.
and I'm talking the same script,
Right.
not good. Because you know
Right.
what? That means that one organization got a bunch of people to click a button that says, I want to put my name on this email, and then they sent it over. Now that's valid. Those are still those people's thoughts, but those mass marketing constituent emails, like one, our office does not have the capacity to respond to thousands of emails. And this is a totally different subject, but I remember back in 2020 with the election, we got so many election fraud emails that our computers almost broke.
Oh, I
Like,
can imagine that. Yeah.
yeah, my computer was like steaming because it was just like it was almost like an actual impediment to the work, because you'd be seeing an email and then suddenly it's gone, and 30 emails, 40 emails. We've never seen anything like that since, but that's not helpful. Now that was a different issue, obviously. Um, but when we get a lot of emails, like, yeah, we note it. It's definitely a factor when we're seeing a bunch of our people think the same thing. But I think it means more when you can tell that it's somebody actually writing their own email,
Right.
or like making their own phone call, because like the automated emails, like it comes off as like spam.
Right.
So I think, and we can tell the difference,
Right.
and all of it is important, but in terms of like the weight that it carries, like seeing unique emails, like with some of the clean energy bills that we got last year, there was some hubbub over like we have a waste energy facility that's near the district, and it's a very complicated issues, but we got a million emails about that, but they were all unique. It was a very, very
Oh,
genuine
interesting.
issue. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
but then sometimes issues that are not specific to our district, we will just get the generic mass communication emails, and we note it, but I'm not going to say that it has like the most impact versus like constituent focused tailored communications.
So what I tell people, and I think this works, but it'd be great to hear from a staffer. If you are a constituent and you want to email on an issue, and let's say it's just a straightforward email to your office, that you put in the header constituent email and then the bill that you're interested in, and that in the body of the email you indicate where you live, the city,
Mhm.
and that you're a constituent and this is an important issue for you, and make it personal. Is that somewhat
Yeah.
effective? Yeah, I mean, I
Oh,
assumed that.
absolutely.
Yeah,
And I guess we gotta like define like effective. I mean, like it definitely has like an impact, but what's more important is like the relationship that's built from it, and making sure that all of our constituents feel heard.
right.
And like one thing that you'll know is that like and this is okay, we're really getting into the nitty gritty, but we can't ever promise a vote on
Right.
anything,
Right.
because like we talked about earlier, the bill has to go through so many processes that we can't say. I mean, there are a very few examples of like, yes, we have support it, but like supporting a concept is different than voting yes on the bill
And
because it's a
that's another great important point because I see a difference between a soft yes, which is I support the bill, and a hard yes is like I will vote yes on this bill. Yeah.
100%
Yeah.
completely different because like we've seen, I remember um back, I think this is 2021. Unemployment insurance was a big thing in states all across the country, and that was a really, really big issue during the pandemic. And there was a bill that was introduced that would basically require the UIA to use plain language. And I might get some of the details wrong on this, but the overall execution of it is kind of what matters. It was focused on like, UIA notices are notoriously difficult to read. It's like you have been approved for a denial or something,
Right.
like,
Right. Yeah.
and it causes so much heartache, and that's what we have to help people with. Well, that bill was, co-sponsored by like a million Democrats and I think a few Republicans. And when it was on the floor, the Republicans subbed that bill out for a bill that would like eliminate some of the pandemic extension programs like PUA and whatever they were
Right.
called. It was the same bill number, but it got swapped out to do something completely different. So if
Right.
we made a promise like, oh, we are going to vote yes on HB 4444, whatever it was, and then now that bill does something completely different, and we're on the record supporting it. It's just like a unfortunate like technical thing we have to keep an eye out for.
Right.
So often when constituents reach out, it's like, okay, like when we take our vote, we want you to know that we take this seriously and we're considering it and we're supportive of the concept, but maybe we need to figure out a few issues with the bill because sometimes there's just straight up technical issues with it too that we can't support, even if the idea is good.
Right.
There are so many good ideas that are poorly executed, and it's politically a headache to deal with because it's like, well, yeah, we love the concept, but like it's kind of broken, you know?
Yep. Yep. Um, I've also of the ilk now, rather than emails, if a legislative office has a here's a contact form you can fill out, which often
Yeah.
requests your address. That kind of, in my mind, is a better way to do it because if you are a constituent, you're going to be tagged as a constituent through that address that you put in. And
Yeah.
you may even be in a system that's set up to help respond to some of those requests.
No, I think the form is good. The form was the best way that we handled like UIA intake
Yeah,
in the early days. Because it just like streamlined everything and things would get automatically filled out and it just made things a lot easier.
right,
You could do that. You can email. I mean, like we have an email address, I
right.
think like higher level offices are a little bit more coy about handing out like a direct email. Usually it is
They
the
are, yeah.
form.
Hmm.
Yeah, but like State House offices, like our email address is there. So like even like it's why one of our other staffers is out sick today that usually mans the district inbox, which was my job in the past. And now I'm like, oh God, I have to go back in there because it's, hundreds of emails every single day that you kind of have to, sort through.
Right.
But yeah, I think the form is probably one of the easier ways that because like once again, like you said, if you're forced to supply your address, that helps us.
Yeah,
We track folks, that
right,
reach out to us. We want a record of communications. So when you reach out again, even if a different staffer is here, we remember you.
right.
It's really, really critical.
Yeah, that I think yeah, all these things are so interesting in the age where there's so many different ways to communicate, and I think it all goes really back to what you talked about with the coalition building and coalitions being that trusted, not only trusted by the rep, but trusted by those who want to see change or feel that they're constituent advocates. And I've always encouraged them to work through the coalition, and when there's a time to
Yeah.
make that critical communication, we'll let you know when that happens. But otherwise, it's a really coordinated approach that you need. And
You need to be, and that's why I commend you guys in the coalition because I thought your advocacy was really really good. You guys had an advocacy day where you have set up a bunch of in-person meetings.
right,
And I haven't really mentioned that, but in-person meetings, if you can get one, far better than anything else.
I agree. Yeah,
Like what 100%. Now they're harder to get, but maybe a little bit harder to coordinate, but just that in-person face-to-face interaction, it just means so much more. It leaves such a greater impression. So when you guys had all those meetings with reps and you guys brought little gifts and stuff, I mean, it was very coordinated and effective effort.
Especially if you follow up later too. Like, hey,
And follow up.
yeah,
And we need to
here's the bill we
follow
were
up.
talking about. Yep. And then but
Yeah.
also, I mean, I imagine when if I've lobbied in New York and in Minnesota, we just would drop in. And often it was
Yeah.
just the staffer that was available. The staffer sometimes had time to talk, sometimes often didn't because they're
Yeah.
dealing with a gazillion things. So I'm assuming though that sometimes if you all you have is a staffer to talk to, that's valuable as well.
Yeah. There's a bad, like, what's the word I'm trying to know, but like conception that like staff don't matter and
Right,
sometimes and like
exactly.
people get bummed out that they have to talk to staff, which by the way I get it, like that's my position, which is always fun, of like being the person that they don't really want to talk to, but it's like the second best thing. I'm very fortunate to have a very hands-on boss where like she knows as much as I do. There's no like, we communicate really really well. Maybe there's other offices where like a staffer won't communicate well with their boss, um but staff are sometimes the best people to talk to.
I agree.
Like they know the ins and outs sometimes better than their boss does in terms of like the workflow. Like that's the thing with like staff, is that your boss is busy being a representative, and there's a lot to that job, and it's a lot harder, it's a lot more taxing, and that's why they need staff to focus on the nitty gritty and the things that they just can't keep track of. Like my boss doesn't know all of our bill numbers because
Right.
she's doing a million other things. That's my job. So like when you're talking to a staffer, you might be talking to the actual person that's going to send the email that you want sent.
Exactly.
They're the ones executing it.
Yeah.
And some of the nitty gritty stuff, which I think is important to know. Now that doesn't mean there's not merit to talking to a representative, because what I try to emphasize to a lot of people too is that I'm not the rep. Like when they're talking to me, like the last thing I can do is like give you a position that I don't know if she has,
Right.
which is hard, because then you kind of fall into that rhythm of being a staffer that's giving a lot of non-answers. Now I try not to do that. I try to have as substantive conversations as I can, and I do. But at the end of the day, I can't convey a position until I've talked to my boss about it. So I think just understanding that I and other staffers are not the decision makers necessarily, but we're the people that can talk to our bosses and convey what you've said and maybe advocate for you a little bit, but ultimately it's the rep that makes that decision.
Yeah, and I can't underestimate the value of working and talking with staffers. Because of that, you have the ear of your boss,
Yeah.
and your boss may ask you, "What do you think of this issue?" In fact, I bet
Yeah.
they ask you that all the time.
Oh yeah, I mean, advising counsel is like a
Yeah,
lot of like what you do, because like I think that's so important, is kind of having like a core group of people make a decision or advise, and ultimately respecting whatever your boss chooses to do. That's another thing about being a staffer that may not be like a big thing we talk about now, is like when I disagree with my boss, but she's the rep, so we're going to execute it no matter what, and that's part
right.
of being a staffer. That's your job. You are one of the, especially in the state house offices, like we talked about. Like, and I'm not saying I'm the only person that talks to my boss. There are a million voices and people that she trusts, but like, it's a small crew. So, like, if you're talking to me or other staff or Erica, like, eventually we're going to talk to our boss about this.
Yeah, exactly. That's really useful. So we have 5148, 5149. It's in the Senate.
Yeah.
Looking forward to that. Hopefully moving. You never know.
Yeah.
But it's been a really useful conversation. And I
No, I'm
think
so
you've
glad.
touched on issues that I think I get questions about all the time. Not only about effectiveness of communication, but how what a staffer does and how important that staffer is in the whole scheme of things. So I really appreciate you sitting down and talking to us about this.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I've been doing this like job for a while, and sometimes, it's you kind of get into the same rhythms, and I almost forget what I do because it's so natural. Like it's just what I do. So sometimes I like talking about it because I say it out loud, and I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool. Oh, this is a
Yeah.
cool job. Appreciate you reaching out and talking to them. I can't wait to listen to hear what the other staffers say too.
Yeah, I mean it all aligns, and they're saying somewhat different stuff, but often there's a common message about how things work and how important staffers are. Not only legislative staff to a rep or a senator, but let's say the staff in a committee, who
Yeah,
does all the arranging of getting everything together and having that committee hearing is this crucial person that you really have to have
yeah,
hopefully a good relationship with, and that's also we lean on people like you, Max, who know those committee chair aides
yeah.
and are important in setting the agenda. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to just talk to a million people to get anything done. It's
Right.
all people work,
Yeah.
at the end of the day. So it makes it more fun and more of a headache, but more fun.
What Next is written and hosted by me, Gregory Luce, and is a production of Adoptees United, Inc., a national nonprofit charitable organization dedicated to equality for all adopted people. Please follow, subscribe, and rate us wherever you get your podcasts, and sign up for the newsletter at adopteesunited.org/whatnext. And consider supporting us with a tax-deductible donation at adopteesunited.org/donate. Anything you provide helps us keep the lights on. See you next time.